Russell Wilson and to discuss large quarterback contracts, of which we are very familiar here in Minnesota. Our friend Robert Mays from The Ringer. What's going on, Robert?
Not a lot, man. How you doing?
I am doing really well. OTAs, tomorrow we get to go out there. I was just yelling hot route on the radio before this, so it's a good day. I want to start with the interesting sort of I don't know, with the two quarterbacks that you wrote about in part, Russell Wilson and Dak Prescott. And with Russell Wilson, you have someone who won a Super Bowl and who is consistently able to drag his team into the playoffs, even if his offensive coordinator is working against him. And so for a guy like that, Robert, I feel like, yeah, just pay the man. You can fill out the other parts around him. You won't have to worry about quarterback. Dak Prescott is super interesting to me, Robert, because he's kind of in that same category in my mind as Kirk Cousins, where you need everything going well around the guy to be super competitive. So if you pay him, you put yourself in a tough position. How do you feel about that?
I agree. I think that that's an entirely different conversation than what I wrote about. And I think that we've had that conversation so many times, and it feels like teams keep eschewing the downsides of that conversation. But it's like, we'll figure it out. We don't want to lose the guy. Teams are so afraid of quarterback purgatory and of the unknown that they're just handing out these deals. So I think I addressed that in like the first couple of graphs. I was like, let's not talk about whether it's worth it because they're going to do it anyway. So now that they're going to do it anyway, let's figure out the ramifications of it. But if I were them and if I were us, I would definitely be apprehensive for sure.
Don't you think that it's for good reason that these teams are terrified, though, of ending up in quarterback purgatory? Because once you let that guy go, until you find the next guy, it's very, very hard to be relevant in the NFL again. Just look around at some of the franchises in the NFL that can't find quarterbacks and their recent history. It is not good. So don't you think there's good reason for that?
I do. I absolutely do. I don't know. I would be the same way because I think that it is a scary proposition. But I also think there are more competent quarterbacks than there have ever been. Just because of training, just the way that the league and the sport work now, you have these guys throwing thousands of passes from the time that they're teenagers. And I think that right now it's easier to find a guy that you can live with. I think it's just as hard as it's ever been to find a great one. So, but I think this for some teams, they haven't really transitioned into, well, we can find a guy to make this work at least. I think it's more about infrastructure now outside of the top 3 or 4 guys. And I'll be curious to see if a team is willing to bet on their infrastructure. You have a couple that will be coming up here relatively soon. The one that people talk about most often, I feel like, is Jared Goff with the Rams. If the Rams decided to go the cheap route again, how much would they really lose? Things like that. I think Bears and Mitchell Trubisky will have that conversation. But I'm with you. I understand the fears of it, but I think that some teams could really derive a lot of value out of saying, we're just going to roll the dice on a cheap guy again and maintain that financial flexibility.
So, Robert, when you look at the Vikings situation with Kirk Cousins and how they handled this offseason, would you use that as an example of, hey, this is a quarterback that you can live with, that you paid for, and look, they're still going to be a very competitive team? Or would you kind of look at it through a different lens and say, yeah, but they still might have to trade Kyle Rudolph because they have no cap space and they weren't able to pay for some of the better offensive linemen, so they end up with Josh Klein, and that's still not going to work. Which way do you tend to look at the situation here in Minnesota?
I think there's such an interesting case because they're so good at managing the cap. I mean, to have the roster they have right now with the quarterback making $30 million is absolutely crazy. And there are reasons behind that, right? I mean, Danielle Hunter, why these guys take some of these contracts, I'll still never understand. The Danielle Hunter contract, Adam Thielen is still relatively cheap this year. The new money will come a little bit later. So their ability to retain so much of this talent cheaply while having that quarterback, I think they're in this very strange middle ground where it's maybe not a quarterback that should be making this much money, but it's also not hurting you, if that makes sense. The offensive line thing, I see where you're coming from, but do you want to be the team handing Juwan James a $30 million, like a record-setting contract? Do you want to be the team making Matt Paradise, guys like that, the highest paid centers in the league, or Mitch Morse? It feels like offensive line free agency is such a terrible thing to wade into that I don't mind ending up with Josh Klein and Garrett Bradbury and going from there. So, again, I think that the Vikings have been able to really avoid the pitfalls while maintaining a really good roster, and that's not easy.
That being said, we were just discussing in the previous segment briefly the possibility of them extending Kirk Cousins 1 year from now. Do you think, given what you just said, that would be the smart move, or do you think they should be one of these teams who says, you know what, we'll let this guy walk and take our chances?
That's a really interesting question. I think that it depends. I'm going to cop out here. It depends on where they are with the rest of the roster by then. Do they feel like Xavier Rhodes is in long-term plans? Do they extend some of these guys that are going to be up here pretty soon? I tend to think with how many kind of longer-term commitments they have that it wouldn't be the silliest thing in the world if they did that, but I still don't think it's necessarily a given at this point.
Robert, when you look at how teams spend money, what do you think just philosophically is the right way? Because if we're using the Vikings as an example, even with Kirk Cousins' contract, they still are spending the third most cap space on their defense. And certainly they've gone all in with Mike Zimmer and defense. And that, in my mind, lowers your floor. But I'm not sure that it gets your ceiling quite high enough to win as much as putting a ton of offensive talent around a good, not great quarterback. What do you think about that? I mean, do you think that this can still work of trying to load up a defense the way that the Vikings have?
Yes, because I think that they did the right thing when it comes to, you're talking about philosophically and the right ways to approach this. They've done it the right way on the other side. I don't necessarily think the Vikings are suffering offensively because they don't have the money to spend. I mean, yes, they need a third receiving option. I mean, yes, it could have been nice to go out and find a slot guy or somebody else. I mean, I don't know if he was like the slot. You know what I mean? Like a third option. But I think that they're fine. I think that going out and giving Diggs, giving Thielen these contracts years before they hit free agency, by never even considering the idea of what we would have to do with the franchise tag, these things, that's how you're able to afford really good rosters. The Seahawks did that for years. It wouldn't matter. You'd be 2 years away. They'd be like, all right, let's hand this guy a contract now. Because with the way the cap has exploded, there are so many deals that are going to ruin the market for these guys as soon as they get handed out. Because mediocre to middling players are getting these record-setting contracts because they're the ones that hit free agency. So I think the more often you can just avoid that problem entirely, just say we're never even going to have the franchise tag be a consideration for us because we're going to get these things done so early. That's why they've been able to do what they've been able to do. So I understand what you're saying with the defense, but I still think money is not necessarily the problem for them. It's Laquan Treadwell not being the guy they thought he was going to be. Things like that.
Isn't free agency itself the biggest potential pitfall for an NFL general manager and front office at large? I think a lot of fans see that as the be-all, end-all and the saving grace of an NFL team and the quickest way to turn things around. But more than not, if I'm right, Robert, it seems like free agent signings don't really live up to expectations and the money that they're given.
No, it's very hard for guys that hit free agency to exceed what they were given, right? It's hard to maintain that and get that return on the value. I think that's the biggest thing. There are guys where you'll sign him to a contract and be like, oh yeah, he's been pretty good. Like you're one of the Bears having Allen Robinson. I'm not upset about that. He didn't necessarily blow up the stat sheet, but he's a very good player. But it's still hard to exceed those contracts. And that's the problem. And I think that what you see with guys on rookie deals, we see them exceeding it all the time. So kind of ignoring those contracts in free agency and saying, let's keep building through the draft, that's not just a platitude. You're building through the draft because it's easier to recoup value on those things than it is on free agent contracts. So I'm with you. I think it's really hard to find good signings. The season where it worked out for teams, a year later, it didn't work out. Think about the Giants and what they did that 1 year where they rebuilt their defense. And a year later, you're looking at those deals and be like, God, we can't afford this stuff. They just traded Olivier Vernon. I mean, these things fall apart very quickly when you build something through free agency. It's absolutely a house of cards.
No, you're definitely right about that. But I keep doing this alternate reality Vikings in my head, Robert, where instead of bringing back Anthony Barr, they signed Golden Tate. And I understand your point about offensive linemen being overpaid, but instead of drafting Garrett Bradbury, you do sign Matt Paradis or Morse or whatever other free agent center that you can fill in, and then you draft a weapon instead. Okay, so if you follow me down this path, I get to thinking about the Rams, right? And they bring in Robert Woods, and for a year they've got Sammy Watkins, and they get Andrew Whitworth, and they just load up with these free agent players on offense, and then they're able to execute anything they want with Jared Goff and kind of hang on defense because they have one superstar and Wade Phillips, who's really good. I guess I'll be thinking about this all season long, of the decision to bring back Barr and not sort of going Eagles with Alshon Jeffrey or something like that. Because I guess I will always wonder how good Kirk Cousins would have been if you could emulate his time in Washington, where he had all those stars and weapons and good offensive line around him.
I can understand what you're saying. I think that what I was saying before, that spending money on defense, I don't think is the wrong way to do it. I think that that's more of a broad, long-term plan. I think the specificity of the Barr thing and the recency of it, I'm with you there, because I just don't know if I want to pay him that contract, and the resources are a little bit more scarce now. So I can understand that. In your mind, though, who is the most, like, the type of receiver? Like, if you could build the guy that would be that third option in that offense, what type of player is it? Because if Thielen's going to play inside and you have Diggs, it's probably an outside the numbers sort of player. And do you want a speed element? I mean, what are you looking for? Because I've thought about this a lot, and I don't know where I land.
See, I liked the idea of Golden Tate because he gets you yards without having to do a lot, right? Like,
Sure.
just, last year they were doing this with Stefon Diggs, because guess what? Again, they're not going to have a great offensive line. It's going to be improved, but this isn't going to be a top 15 offensive line, I don't think, because of who the tackles are still. So last year against Philly was a great example. They did it against the Rams, a lot of quick passes to Diggs, but that's not really what you want Stefon Diggs doing all the time. It is what you want a playmaker like Golden Tate doing, or somebody else in the draft. Paris Campbell might have been a guy that if you could just throw him the ball on quick passes, then he can make plays with his legs. I think you want to be able to get the ball out quick to help the offensive line, but also to help Kirk Cousins with getting yards where he doesn't have to make a perfect throw or sit in the pocket and take a big hit all the time.
I see where you're coming from. Let me play devil's advocate. So two different reasons I think that the roster they have now, and this is before the Rudolph decision gets made, so that's the caveat here. I think it's going to be more 2 tight end, 12 personnel sets with that offense than it was previously. So you have those 2 receivers. You have Irv Smith as your second tight end now. I'm thinking about Philly a couple of years ago. They're way more shotgun based than the Vikings are going to be now. But just having that move tight end in Trey Burton with Ertz, and you have 2 receivers on the field most of the time. I think those are the sets you're going to see more often than not if the Vikings are the best version of themselves. 2, I think when you really commit to this outside zone offense and you commit to the play action that goes with it, it does a lot to help your offensive line. It makes those guys look much better than they would be elsewhere or otherwise. And I think that you're going to see that line, if they can stay healthy, which was one of the bigger issues last year, play much better than they did a season ago. So I think that, again, the plan makes sense to me, and I think you could argue that this was the route to go. But I'm a little bit more bullish on how this offense is going to look with these guys than you might be.
Robert, one more question for you. It's actually a 2-parter. What the hell is going on?
2 more questions.
What the hell is going on with the Jets? And do you think it's a real possibility that they trade Le'Veon Bell?
It would be the funniest thing that's ever happened in the history of football. I swear to God, I can't remember what the signing bonus was now, but it must have been, what was it, 15, 20 million? Did he got just instantly in cash? I mean,
probably.
I think so.
That's a lot.
You would be like pouring it into a barrel and lighting it on fire. For that to happen to a professional football team is unbelievable. I just think that I get the argument for firing your GM after the draft. We've seen it happen in other places. It's really hard to build a board and to figure out a plan when you start this process on January 1st and you have scouts that have been doing it forever. I mean, I think the Raiders just canned everybody for that exact reason. So that I understand. But why would you give the guy carte blanche in free agency and allow him to hand out $140 million guaranteed that really, in a monetary way, shapes your football team for the next 2 or 3 years, while your quarterback's rookie contract years are more valuable than they'll ever be, when you thought you'd fire him? It just, you close the wallet if that's the case, or you get a different guy. Because the way they did this is unjustifiable on about 10 different levels.
And then essentially fired him for signing that guy, because reportedly that's the dispute between him and Adam Gase,
Yes.
And he won the dispute and signed Le'Veon Bell, but then they were like, yeah, you're fired for signing. After they signed off on it, it makes no sense whatsoever, and it is glorious and hilarious, Robert.
You know what's great, Robert, is that people will tweet you all season long. Oh, Robert, if you were such a smart football guy, why don't you work for an NFL team? Like, I couldn't mess up the Jets any worse than this, right?
Listen, man, I would be a terrible NFL general manager, but at least I would have a plan. I would do the weirdest stuff you've ever seen, and it would go. I mean, similar to what the Browns did a couple years ago. They were terrible at picking free agents, but they did a decent job of maintaining assets and really building them up, and it's helped. So I think that we have so many teams. Their decisions are born of just terrible thought process. It's just to say, as Mike McCagnon, to know that you're on the hot seat and think, oh man, if I just kind of circle the wagons, if I kind of shut it down, I don't want the new coaching staff into this, I'll be able to be in control here. It's like, why wouldn't you let your coaching staff be a part of the decision-making process when it comes to picking players? They're the ones that know what they want. So, I remember a couple of years ago, I had a long discussion with Thomas Dimitroff about when Dan Quinn got there, just kind of how open the dialogue was between those two sides about these are the types of players we want. And Quinn gave a huge presentation with the entire coaching staff almost immediately upon arriving there. It's a dialogue. It's a constant conversation and a constant discussion between those two sides because they should be working in concert with one another. And it's just stuff like that. It's just there's no reason for that to be the basis on which you start a partnership. So would I be terrible at it? Yes, but I think that I would be able to start in better places than a lot of these teams do.
That's Robert Mays from The Ringer. Robert, I pulled up your Twitter account while we were talking, and I see that you had an interview with Anthony Jeselnik. I plan on reading it, and I encourage everybody to go read it. His latest Netflix special was amazing, man. So everybody go check that out and follow him on Twitter at Robert Mays. Thanks a lot, Robert. Really appreciate it.
Anytime, guys.